All right, well, you're turning there. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. A funny thing's happened to me the past few years. And this is going to sound bad, but I'm going to qualify it, and especially to my wife, I want her to know I'm about to qualify this, okay? Something I've settled into in my mid-30s is there's really not much in life to look forward to anymore. Now, let me explain what I mean by that, okay? That as you grow up, you're basically told there's a few things you need to get in place in life, and once you have those things in place, you'll be happy. And so we're told you graduate high school and go to college and find a spouse and have some kids and find a job that pays the bills, and then you go 20 or 30 years and then you enter into retirement. But they're kind of presented as these are the puzzle pieces, and once you have all the puzzle pieces, you can put this together and you'll be happy and content and satisfied. And what I found was as I was going through the process of putting all these things into place, I was never completely satisfied, but I was always able to tell myself, well, it's just because I don't have this yet. And I got married and I had kids and I've got a job that I wake up excited to go to. And for most of my life, I could tell myself, you're not completely happy yet, but you will be just when this one final piece gets locked into place. And then you get everything you were told, this is what makes a happy, content, successful life. And myself, like many of you, got to a place where you started having this nagging feeling of, okay, but there's got to be more than this because it's not satisfying me in the way that I thought it would. And that's I love being married, love my wife, love my kids, love, like I said, the job that I have. But there is still this isn't doing for me what I thought it would. And this is why midlife crisis has happened. Because you get to a place where you realize, I got everything everyone told me to get, and I'm still not happy, so there's still something I need to go get. A new car, a new relationship, a new job. And the assumption is the plan has to be right because everyone's told me the plan is right. I've just missed something somewhere. And yet there's a generation of people who have done all the things they're supposed to do, and they still have this longing for something else. And we have a generation that's come along that sees the dissatisfaction of the generation ahead of them and has said, well, maybe the plan was wrong. And so in an article entitled The American Dream is Alive and Well, Samuel Abrams writes, when Americans were recently asked what makes the American dream a reality, they did not select as essential factors becoming wealthy, owning a home, or having a successful career. Instead, 85% indicated that to have freedom of choice in how we live was essential to achieving the American dream. And so we have a generation that has said, and I know this is in generalities, but the generation that came before us was chasing the wrong things, and those things are secondary. And if you can get freedom to be who you want to be, to make the decisions that you want to make, to have the life that you want to create, then you will be happy. They were just chasing the wrong things. That was the problem. And yet I think both of those groups would come together and say, we've got freedom, we've got family, house, and job, and none of us are happy. And the question becomes, so what do we do? And it might feel like there's just this curse we're under as human beings that maybe just part of being human is never being fully satisfied with the life that we have, but it is a frustrating place to be. And maybe this should lead us to the thought that if everyone is searching for the same thing in the same places and no one's finding it, maybe we're looking in the wrong place. And that's the whole point of what Paul writes here in 1 Corinthians 1:18 to 2:5, where he highlights to the Corinthians, there is a place to find what you're looking for. You can find significance and identity and love and these things that our world is chasing, but the reason few people ever find it is you find it in one of the most unexpected and surprising places that no one would naturally assume was the answer to all of our questions. And here's how he opens this paragraph, chapter 1, verse 18. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it's written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. And Paul reminds the church right before this, he came to preach about the crucifixion of Jesus, but he reminds the church of something important as he highlights that. The truths about Jesus that many of you and I hold dear on the surface when you just say them out loud sound really foolish. And that's hard to admit, but it's true when you just kind of lay it out. That the reason many of you are here this morning to sing and to worship and to read your Bibles is because we believe 2,000 years ago God became a man, was born into a Jewish family, lived for a little over 30 years, was put to death on a Roman cross, and that moment, the death of Jesus, is what allows human beings to have a relationship with God. Now, we're familiar with it, so that doesn't sound crazy, but you can imagine to someone who's never heard that before, that sounds like a ridiculous idea. And what we've missed or lost is, in the first century, it wasn't just a ridiculous idea, it was an appalling idea. And part of the reason we've missed that is because we've sentimentalized the cross. And we wear it as jewelry, and it's on t-shirts and bumper stickers, and in our churches, you'll see crosses all over this room. And there are many people today who are comforted by the symbol of the cross. But those who originally heard Paul's gospel would have been horrified by the idea that you would ever start a religious group and take as your symbol of who you are the cross. Martin Hengel, one of the most well-respected New Testament scholars of the 20th century, in his short book, Crucifixion, highlights the attitude that many had in Jesus' day and Paul's day toward the crucifixion. And in his first chapter, he simply cites some statements we can find about the cross from early in the history of the church. Justin Martyr, who was an early church leader and theologian, cites a common objection he heard saying, they say that our madness consists in the fact that we put a crucified man in second place after the unchangeable and eternal God. That the church was looked on as mad to many. That Pliny the Younger, who was a first century Roman politician, set out to discover what he could about the church, and he tortured many to try and find out what he could. And after torturing 2 slave girls in particular and interrogating them, the only conclusion he made was, I discovered nothing but a perverse and extravagant superstition, that being that we worship a crucified God. Marcus Felix, another early Christian theologian, writes one of the objections of his opponents when he says, to say that their ceremonies, Christians center on a man put to death for his crime and on the fatal wood of the cross, is to assign to these abandoned wretches sanctuaries which are appropriate them and the kind of worship they deserve. The Jewish historian Josephus reminds us that in the first century, crucifixion was viewed as the most wretched of deaths. Cicero, an early Roman philosopher, claimed the cross was the most humiliating form of punishment in the ancient world. And at the conclusion of this chapter, Hengel summarizes the attitude toward crucifixion in this way, that at relatively small expense and to great public effect, a criminal could be tortured to death for days in an unspeakable way, and that's how most in the first century viewed crucifixion. That it was this public display of power by the Romans, that this was such a humiliating way to die. A Roman citizen could not be put to death this way. But it was used to keep people in check. And as the Romans would publicly crucify people, they were in essence saying, if you challenge us, this is how you will end up. And it was a death for thieves, and it was a death for criminals, and it was one of the most powerful signs of weakness in the ancient world. And yet, this is how the church decided to mark itself. This is our symbol, the cross. It would be like you roll into class tomorrow morning, or you roll into work, and the person in the cubicle next to you has some nice new earrings on, and dangling from their earring is this bright silver electric chair, okay? You'd probably keep an eye on that person. That person, you might get a little HR email going when you saw that. That's what this looked like in the first century to most. Why in the world would you mark yourself in that way? But as Christians did this, and again, Paul kind of gives a flavor of this, that this sounds silly to people. This is folly. That he's preaching to a culture much like ours in search of success and significance and power and prestige. And there's a lot of places you can find those things. You can't find those things hanging on a cross, especially in the first century world. And so what Paul was preaching, what was the center of Paul's message, was the opposite of what everyone was looking for. But in verse 18, he reminds them, but to those being saved, the message of the cross is the power of God. And the obvious question is, how is that possible? We'll get there, but in verse 20, Paul writes, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are being called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. It should be a pretty humbling statement. Paul's brought up the foolishness of the Christian message, but now he brings up the foolishness of worldly wisdom. And he calls out the philosopher. He calls out the professors and the thought leaders of the day. He calls out the scribe or the religious leaders of the day. And he highlights who the Corinthians would have looked to for wisdom. What should life look like? What should our priorities be? Where do we find meaning and significance? And he says, just as the cross appears foolish to most people, it's worldly wisdom that actually looks foolish to God, because there are so many people, as we talked about up front, following this. This is the path you take in this life. This is the way to happiness, and we keep following that path, and no one's happy, and it just seems like this foolish thing we continue to do. Yoko Ono, the wife of John Lennon, took out a full-page ad in the New York Times in 2006, and she wrote as part of this letter, "One day we'll be able to say that we healed ourselves," she promised, "and by healing ourselves, we healed the world." And this is the assumption that most people have. As humans progress, things are going to get better and better, and we're eventually going to solve our problems. Now, life is more comfortable for most people than at any point in human history. There are issues we've solved. There's technological advances that we've made. But as you look at human history, I don't know that anyone would argue we're any closer to solving the primary problems that we have now than they were in the first century. We still can't figure conflict out. We still can't figure out meaning and purpose and identity. We're still wrestling with many of the big questions they did in the first century, and yet we keep pursuing them in the same way over and over. And what Paul's doing here is he isn't saying be anti-intellectual or completely ignore worldly wisdom. He's reminding the Corinthians of the fact that worldly wisdom cannot solve the primary problem that we have. And the ways that we've tried to do that, well, the primary problem that we have, and again, we highlight this often at City of God, is that when the first human beings rebelled against God, and we've continued along with them in their rebellion against God, that a wall went up between us and God. And much of human history, without realizing it, has been an attempt to figure out, how do we scale the wall? How do we get back? How do we bridge this separation between us and God? And there's two common ways people have tried to answer this question. The first, Paul summarizes in this idea that Jews seek signs, that for some, the thought of getting over the wall to God is too difficult. We can't figure out how to do it, so the solution is to create a God for ourselves on this side of the wall that we can control and that's understandable to us. And we see this, that every human being has a desire to worship something, and if we can't find the God who's actually there, we find a God to serve. We find a thing to make the main thing in our life. And so you have many people who have pursued life with God unknowingly by making a God that looks a lot like them, by making a God that they can do a few things and reach, and not surprisingly, that hasn't been satisfying to most people. But Paul says the other approach is that Greeks seek wisdom, or for others, without knowing it, there's this separation between us and God, and so logically we think through, well, if there is a God, here's what he's probably like, here's what he probably wants, and we try and reason our way into this makes the most sense as the path back to God. And for most people, it looks a lot something like, if there is a God, he probably cares about the things that we care about. He probably calls good the things that we call good. And if I do enough of those good things, then God will, or I can walk through a door in this wall and get back to God in that way. Maybe one of the brashest examples of this was when former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg was interviewed. And not many of us would phrase it this way, but plenty of us are following this example. During an interview before his 50th college reunion, former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg confessed that his morality was starting to dawn on him at age 72. He also said that he had been sobered by how many of his former classmates had passed away. But the author of the interview concluded, but if Bloomberg senses that he may not have as much time left as he would like, he has little doubt about what would await him on Judgment Day. Pointing to his work on gun safety, obesity, and smoking cessation, he said with a grin, I'm telling you, if there's a God, when I get to heaven, I'm not stopping to be interviewed. I'm heading straight in. I've earned my place in heaven, and it's not even close. Here's the assumption. If there is a God, we know what he probably wants, and if I do enough of those things, surely he will receive me when I stand before him someday. And that path to God makes sense to most of us because that's how every other situation in our life works. I want a spouse, and so I do enough things to prove my love, and I get a spouse. I want a raise, and so I do enough things at work to earn and justify a raise. I want a new title, and so I go above and beyond so I can earn a new title or a promotion. And everything about our lives teaches us if you will work hard enough and be diligent enough and self-controlled enough, you can earn the things you want in this life. And we drop that onto our relationship with God and assume, well, God must be the same. And so some of you have just restlessly pursued doing good things and being good and trying to be spiritual under the assumption that that will get me back to God. And yet Paul tells us the wisdom of the world, especially when it comes to the things of God, is foolishness. And that contrary to making a God in our own image or contrary to finding our way back to God, Paul says, I come preaching Christ crucified, which is a message that makes sense to no one. Because if you were trying to create a God that looks like you, if you wanted to make up a God, you wouldn't make up a crucified one. That's not a powerful image. That's not an awe-inspiring image. That if you wanted to make a God that makes sense or follow your own wisdom logically back to God, you wouldn't do it through the cross, because how could a sign of such humiliating defeat actually be something that gives us what we want out of this life? And the vision of Jesus on the cross contradicts everything we would naturally expect from God. But again, Paul reminds them, but to those who are called, verse 24, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And over again in this section, Paul keeps reminding the church of an important fact. It's unexpected and it's surprising, and it's the last place you would expect to find the things you're looking for. But it's actually in that vision of Jesus on the cross that we find what humanity is searching everywhere for. But before we can receive that and see what it is, we have to understand an uncomfortable truth about ourselves, verse 26. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. That the Corinthians were trying to find their identity and their success in. Once I have enough degrees or enough connections or enough accomplishments or enough money, that once I check all the boxes on my list, then I can rest, then I can be secure. And maybe the Corinthians were the only ones who believed that, or maybe that reminds you of someone you know pretty well. That once I have all of these things, then I will finally have made it. But in a very pastoral, loving way, Paul says a hard thing to them and to us when he says that if it's ultimately up to us to make something of ourselves, if it's up to us to get back to God, that if our ability to find happiness and contentment rests on us having it all together, then we're actually in a lot of trouble because we're not nearly as impressive as we think we are. I've got a 3-year-old son who loves 4 things in this life. Hopefully Jesus. We're working on it, but he's or 3. Did I say 3 or 4? 3-year-old, 4 things, okay? Faith in God. He loves his family. He loves his sippy cup, and he loves Thor. And I've mentioned this before, but it's only gotten worse. Because all he watches is Thor. All he talks about is Thor. I know more things about Thor than I ever thought I would know in my entire life. And over the course of 2 years, we have put together quite the costume for him. Helmet, mask, cape, multiple hammers laying around the house, and he just runs around terrorizing everybody with these foam hammers that he has. But there was one piece of the Thor ethos that eluded him. If you've ever watched the movies or you know about Thor, one of the things he can do is he stretches his arm out, and his hammer just comes to him. And he can throw it at his enemies, and then it comes back to him. And you can imagine how frustrating it was for a 3-year-old to throw his toy hammer and run across the room and get it, and to throw it. And I would come in the living room and just see him standing there trying so hard and just wanting it so badly. So he went to visit my dad last weekend, and they came up with a solution. I got a video of a bungee cord tied around his wrist and a bungee cord tied around the hammer. And in his head, this is going to be awesome because it would just be him throwing it and coming back and just over and over. The video was actually him throwing it, and he learned pretty quickly. He had no idea where it was going, so he would throw it and then do this. And it was just over and over this. And it was just bouncing off. He had no idea where he was going to get hit. It wasn't very impressive, but he was so happy because his hammer would finally come back to him. Okay? He looks as much like Thor as a 3-year-old can. And yet, if something ever went down, Thanos is real and shows up, he will probably be the most unhelpful person in the world, okay? Because a 3-year-old is not going to do anything, okay? Now, I bring that up, not to just make fun of I love him. Because for as impressive as we look and as powerful as we think we are, when stuff actually goes down, we realize how helpless we really are. And you can talk to the person who's accomplished as much as anyone in the world and seems as prominent and well-connected and polished as anybody, and then an unexpected tragedy comes and they have nothing they can do. And then they get near the end of their life, and they have nothing they can do to stop it. And then they try and create their own happiness and contentment, and they slowly begin to realize there's not a check they can write, there's not an accomplishment they can earn, there's not a title they can have in front of their name that ever solves the deepest, darkest problems of their life. And a lot of us look like this superhero who has it all together, but when stuff really goes down, we're left helpless. And our main problem is there's this wall separating us and God, and the issue we fail to see is there's no way on our own we're scaling that wall. We are completely helpless to do it. That we begin to discover that it's not just that we've made mistakes when it comes to our relationship with God, that we have actively and willingly rebelled against our King and Creator. That we have repeatedly disregarded His words and His will, that we've regularly dismissed and downplayed His authority, and that if we're being honest, often we actively work against His will for our lives and against His will for the lives of others. And so Paul sums up the human condition in Ephesians 2:3, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and we were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. And this is not a condition we can work our way out of. Notice he doesn't say we just do rebellious things. We're rebels by nature. And maybe you're thinking, that's not true. Have kids, bruh, and you will never question that again. I didn't have to teach them to be rebellious. They just are. And we're the same way with God. And so for all of our wanting to get back to God, Paul says the problem isn't just our sin, it's that we're sinners and that rightly we're under the judgment of God. And here is why humanity is so frustrated. The very thing we were created to do and to be, we can't on our own. We have an impossible task before us. To be children of God, in the image of God, living for the glory of God, is an impossibility in our current condition. And so we spend all of our time searching for something to satisfy us without realizing the very thing that would satisfy us we can't create, we can't make, we can't produce, that it's folly for us. And yet Paul comes along with a message, a foolish message to the world, offering everything that we're looking for. 1 Corinthians 1:28-31, God chose what's low and despised in the world, even the things that are not, to bring nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God, and because of Him you're in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. To sum up what Paul has just said is this: you're never going to scale the wall back to God on your own, but if you'll receive it, Jesus has knocked the wall down. Maybe the best way to explain our issue with God is to talk in terms that many of you currently understand, which is debt, okay? And most of you are a couple of years away from beginning to pay back what will seem like an insurmountable amount of debt. And imagine had someone just showed up here this morning and said, you know what? Don't worry about it. This happened at a 2009 commencement service. John Ortberg tells the story. He says, in May of 2009, my family was at Azusa Pacific University. My wife Nancy was going to speak at commencement, so she and I were invited to a special gathering of about 50, and people from the graduating class of 50 years ago, and a few faculty members were there. During the gathering, John Wallace, the president, brought out 3 students who were graduating that year, and he told us for the next 2 years they were going to serve the poorest of the poor in India. These 3 students thought they were just coming to be commissioned and sent out with a blessing, which they were, but then something happened they didn't know was coming. John turned to them and said, I have a piece of news for you. There's somebody you do not know, an anonymous donor, who was so moved by what you're doing, he's given a gift to this university in your name on your behalf. And so John turned to the first student and said, you are forgiven your debt of $105,000. The kid started crying, as you would expect. He turned to the next student, you're forgiven your debt of $70,000. He turned to the third, you're forgiven your debt of $130,000. All three students had no idea this was coming. They were just ambushed by grace, blown away that somebody they don't even know would pay their debt, and the whole room was in tears. And it's one thing to hear about that. It's another thing to experience it. So I'm going to invite three of you on the stage right now. No, I'm not. Some of you rightly remembered, like, their walls were made out of curtains last space. Here's a $10 Chick-fil-A card. We could do something like that. You can imagine that feeling of this debt I don't know how to pay back, and immediately it's gone. And the reason Paul preached Christ crucified was this: if you would believe it and receive it, this insurmountable debt we owe to God that we can never earn our way back or pay our way out of it, Jesus will relieve it from your shoulders today. But it requires trusting in and believing something that seems so foolish to the world around us. And as we talk about how does Jesus demolish the wall between us and God, Paul says it happens in three moves. One, he became our righteousness. And what that means is this, is that on the cross, Jesus wasn't just physically put to death, but spiritually took our sin and our shame and our guilt and all of those things that separate us from God. Jesus takes on himself, that he takes the judgment of God that we deserve on the cross, that as Paul writes in Ephesians 2:3, we were children of wrath, that Jesus becomes the child of wrath on the cross. And that in our place, if we'll receive it, Jesus takes the death that we deserve to die so that we can be given a new identity as children of God and forgiven and innocent in the courtroom of God because our debt has been paid. But not only that, we're told he becomes our sanctification. He's the thing that makes us holy. And if you trust and believe in Jesus on the cross for you, you become a part of the family of God. And you might say, but I don't look like that. I haven't earned that. I can't put that on my resume on my own. And it's solely this, that as we trust in the finished work of Christ, you come into a room and you believe it and you leave with God looking at you and saying things, crazy things like, you're a saint. And you're my child, and you're my son, and you're my daughter, and things that should never be true of us, but Jesus makes them true for us. And finally, Paul reminds us that the Corinthians he says Jesus was our redemption. And this is a word that comes from the Exodus story. If you remember, the people of God were in slavery in Egypt, and he delivered them and brought them into freedom. And that word used to describe that transition as the people of God were redeemed out of their slavery. And it's in that moment when Jesus hung on the cross in seeming the most humiliating defeat he could suffer that the people of God were redeemed. And we were brought out from under our sin and out from under the judgment of God and out from under all of the things that weigh us down. That in the wisdom of God, it's the very moment that seemed like Jesus' greatest defeat that he was actually accomplishing for us all that we could never do on our own. We'll close with this and the band can come up. 1 Corinthians 2, 1-5, Paul writes, "And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God." Paul, in essence, saying to the Corinthians, I could have come trying to impress you. I could have come with a lot of different messages, and I know my message is foolish, but it's the only thing I have to offer you. And the same thing, I think, is true of this church. There's a lot of things we could try and offer you. We could try and help you become a better parent. And we could try and help you figure out your finances and become a better spouse and a better friend. And we could try and help you get your stress in check. And we could try and entertain you and just make this a place you're happy to come and see friends and be impressed with me and our leaders and our programs and all of those things. But at the end of the day, Paul's reminding the church that we can do and offer a lot of foolish things. And that on my own, I'll just speak for me, I have nothing to offer you of value. Why would you want to follow my example? Most of you didn't know this, but the reason I had black eyes the last 2 weeks is because my nose was broken, because I'm a 35-year-old man who still does professional wrestling on the side. And there's no way you should look at that man and think, that's what I want. That's the one I want to follow. Okay? I may have nothing to offer you. This church may have nothing to offer you other than this. Paul says, as we point people to Jesus and we point people to the cross, we're wholly insufficient for these things. But in that message, you find the power of God. That if there's any life change here, it's Christ crucified. That if there's people being saved here, it's Christ crucified. That a city of God 10 years in is going to do anything of lasting value in the city, it's going to be pointing people to Christ crucified, because it's on the cross Jesus takes what I deserve so that I can receive from God more than I ever deserved. And we're going to resolve as a church to know that and only that, because it's in that truth we finally find what we're looking for. I'm going to pray and we'll sing. Father, thank you for this morning and our time together.